Hi, it's William with the Death in Literature video series. This is number 10, I believe, and I wanted to do this one today no matter what, because for those of you, though small in number, who have been watching faithfully, I just want to let you know that I will probably be slowing down a bit and doing one a week, because originally I thought, well, I'll be doing 5 books at a time and I'll just be quickly saying what the death was in each book that really stood out to me. But I'm not really capable of doing that. I end up talking at length, and instead of trying to counter that natural proclivity, I am going to slow down so that I can do the preparation that I need to do. So I wanted to do Dracula next, but that's definitely a book. It has multiple deaths. It has a lot of sub-content and subtext. And so I want to do it properly. So I thought, well, in order to be able to make this announcement, I will look for a book that I genuinely can do without much preparation. Not necessarily as a short video, alas, but without much preparation. So the book I came up with is another one, like Cocteau's Les Enfants Terribles, that's really quite obscure, that you kind of have to go looking for, and you have to sort of find a reference to it somewhere else before it's on your radar screen. For me, since I have a PhD in Russian history, it was on the radar screen for that reason, but also because of my association with the town of Davos, Switzerland, and my work there on the Davos and Sanatorium Schatzalp during the sanatorium era. And this is a book that was very controversial. Everywhere where people found it, it was controversial. And in Davos, which had a huge Russian colony at that time prior to the First World War, it was considered so controversial that they actually had a big meeting about it within the Russian community, not really to condemn it, but just to discuss it, because it had created such waves. And it was a book that was, for a while, banned, I think, in Russia because of it supposedly containing pornography and blasphemy. And certainly by the standards of the day. I mean, if you want to read something smutty, then, you know, go to Anais Nin or read Nan or read Fanny Hill. Because Sanin is not all that titillating. But I will show you a lot of my books these days. I buy the ebooks because they're, not because I prefer them, but because they're cheap and convenient. But this one I actually have the hardcover. It's by Mikhail Artsybashev or Artsybashev. I'm not sure about that. But you can see this sort of entangled, sinuous bodies back behind the main character here. And the book is not about sex, and it's not about death. It's about freedom. It's about different concepts of freedom, both intellectually and abstractly, and in the way people are living their lives. There's a famous book, a famous line in it, spoken by a woman who's had sex outside of marriage, of course, a single woman. And she sort of vacillates between being horrified and thinking, well, yeah, damn right I did that. So the quote is, I wanted to do it and I did it. And this was a huge topic in Russia. Sanin was published in 1907, but there were other books that preceded it. One was called What Is to Be Done, by Mikhail Artsybashev, 1863, and that kind of became the Bible of the revolutionary movement, even though it was a novel. And again, this subject of, if you're a revolutionary, how do you live your life? So Sanin wasn't really about that, but, you know, the same kind of ideas, the same kind of novel of ideas about how people who are nonconformists should be living their lives and according to what philosophy. And that book made such a huge impression on that element of people within Russia that Lenin later used the title, What is to be Done, for a book of his, Vladimir Lenin. And then I'm told, although I haven't looked into it, that Sanin itself was kind of written as a reaction to the famous Turgenev novel, Fathers and Sons, or Fathers and Children, which was written in 1880. So Sanin was, of course, 27 years later. But again, Fathers and Son famously talked about nihilism or nihilism as a political philosophy, and actually both What is to be Done and Fathers and Sons had a sort of revolutionary asceticism included in them. Anyway, that's enough about that. And what I want to do in relation to Sanin, and the reason I want to do it, is because it has, what it stands out for me, is its depiction of a particular death. And the fact of the matter is, it is not a book that you'll want to read for the plot or the particularly engrossing characters. You know, it's a middling kind of novel in that respect. It really is a novel of ideas, which are worth reading as long as one, you know, one sees them, views them within their historical and cultural context. Then it becomes really a fascinating book. But yeah, what absolutely stood out to me and what led me to read the book again was this description of a man dying of a disease, not surprisingly, tuberculosis, which was just everywhere. You know, nowadays you have more novels and nonfiction that focuses on cancer and you know, the whole sometimes slow progression of the disease and how people come, you know, make their peace or don't make their peace with terminal disease in the form of cancer. This book, as in most 19th and early 20th century works, was all about TB. And so I want to read you, there's a character named Semyonov, and I want to read you quite extensively. There's one chapter, chapter 11, that deals with Semyonov's death and with the process that he goes through leading up to it. And I think very much, as I read this, about my mother's experience dying of ovarian cancer over the course of 2 years with one brief period of remission, and also with the death of Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich at the sanatorium Schatzalp in Davos. And so I have actually a video series on Dmitry on my channel. You can find it. He describes some things that could almost be word for word in this account of the death of Semyonov. Not everything, but so I'm going to read that to you, and the whole chapter. It's short. It's not a long chapter. It is, let's see, here in my edition, 74, half of 74, and then culminating with half of page 78. So I'll dive into that. When Semyonov saw his own blood and felt the ominous emptiness around and within him, and when later they lifted him up, carried him away, put him to bed, and did everything for him that he used to do for himself, he understood that he was dying and felt strange that he wasn't afraid of death in the least. When Dubova referred to his fear, she'd reached that conclusion because she herself was afraid. Fear in a healthy person confronted by death convinced her that a dying person must fear it infinitely more. She, like all the others, interpreted Semyonov's pallor and wandering gaze, actually resulting from his weakness and loss of blood, as an indication of his fear. But that wasn't really the case, just as the question posed by him to the doctor already wasn't really the case either. Semyonov had always feared death, especially since learning that he had consumption. When he first found out, his condition was terribly tormenting. In all likelihood, it resembled that of a man with no hope of reprieve from a death penalty. It almost seemed to him that the world had ceased to exist from that moment. Everything he'd previously found so beautiful, pleasant, and cheerful had disappeared irrevocably. Everything was dying and in a state of insufferable agony, which right now, any minute or any second, must be resolved by something unbearably horrible, yawning like a black abyss. It was precisely in the form of a huge, round, totally black abyss that Semyonov imagined death. Wherever he went, whatever he did, this round black void stood before him. All sounds, colors, and sensations were lost and vanished in its black emptiness. So here I'd just like to interject and remind you, if you watched the video about the Lord of the Flies, that we have this same imagery here of a kind of death as a kind of round, black, like a mouth almost, that swallows things up, the devouring mother, the devouring form of the Great Mother. And so that's interesting, and now I'll resume. This was a terrible frame of mind, but soon it began to diminish. The more time passed and the closer Semyonov got to death, the further away from it he felt, and the less intelligible and distinct it became to him. Everything around him, all sounds, colors, and sensations, remained exactly as he had always known them. The sun shone just as brightly, people went about their business in the same way, and Semyonov himself had both important and unimportant things to do. Just as before, he got up in the morning, carefully washed himself, had dinner at noon, found tasty things good to eat and nasty things not so good. Just as before, he enjoyed seeing the sun and moon and was angry at the prolonged rain and slush. As before, he played billiards with Novikov and others in the evening, read books, and couldn't help finding some of them important and interesting, others boring and foolish. At first, it seemed strange, insulting, even disturbing that everything around him remained as before, not only in nature and in the people surrounding him, but in himself as well. He tried to change all this, to force everyone to take an interest in him and his death, to comprehend the full horror of his predicament, to realize that everything was over. But when he talked about it to his acquaintances, he saw that it wasn't right to do so. At first, his acquaintances were surprised. Then they didn't believe it, although they expressed their sympathy and their disbelief in the doctor's grim prognosis. Then they tried to banish the unpleasant impression by talking insistently about something else. And a minute or two later, Semyonov himself, without noticing it, was talking with them not about death, but about life. All his efforts to involve the whole world in what was happening to him turned out to be entirely ineffectual. I'll pause here again and say that this makes me think of Dmitri when he first was diagnosed with tuberculosis and was losing weight and experiencing very alarming symptoms. He tried to hide them from people. But then later, when he checked into the sanatorium, he found that people didn't believe him. His sister, for instance, didn't believe that he really needed to be in a sanatorium, that he was really dying. And he would write these frustrated entries in his diary saying, she doesn't understand. I can't even walk down the stairs. And so, Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor is another good book to read with issues like that. Now I'll resume. Then he tried to withdraw, become introspective, and suffer all alone the complete and invincible awareness of the full horror of his death. But it was precisely because everything remained the same all around him and in his own life that it seemed absolutely absurd to imagine that it could be otherwise, and that he, Semyonov, wouldn't always exist in exactly the same way as he did now. And the thought of death, at first piercing his heart sharply, began to grow less acute and to release his constricted soul. Moments of complete oblivion began to occur more and more frequently, and once again life became richer with its colors, movements, and sounds. A sense of the proximity of the round black abyss came only in the late evenings when he was alone. When he put out the light, it seemed to him in the darkness that something formless and faceless rose slowly above him and whispered inexorably, "Shh, shh, shh." And to this soundless, ceaseless whispering in the darkness, something from within him replied in another miserable, horrible whisper. Then he felt as if everything were merging more and more into this whisper, this emptiness, this darkness, and that his own body was quivering in this chaos of whispers, emptiness, and darkness, like a slender, pathetic splinter of wood, ready to disintegrate at any moment and disappear without a trace. Another interjection. Now, this is the part that so much makes me think of Dmitri in his diary. He talked about exactly this. During the day, he could function and forget about it, but once the lights went off at night and he was by himself, he was just terrified. And so I never talked to my mom about that. That's one of the problems, is the distance that we have between dying people and ourselves. We don't want to upset them by talking about their death to come. And, you know, we don't ask things like this. And maybe they don't, you know, I mean, it's on a person-by-person basis, right? Whether they want to talk about it or not, whether they're in a state of mind at that precise moment when they want to talk about it. But, you know, I feel bad that Dmitri experienced that. I feel bad if, in fact, my mother experienced that. Okay, resuming. Then he took to sleeping with the lamp still lit. In its light, the whisper became inaudible, the darkness receded, and the sense of all-enveloping emptiness disappeared because it was filled by thousands of details of daily life, all very ordinary and understandable. The chairs, the light, the inkstand, his own feet, an unfinished letter needing to be finished, an icon with a lamp he'd never lit, boots he'd forgotten to leave outside the door, and other items and cares surrounding him. Yet even when the whisper was heard in those corners where the lamplight didn't reach, the darkness grew thicker there, and the same all-enveloping emptiness yawned like a bottomless pit. Semyonov was afraid to look into the darkness and to think about it. All he had to do was remember the darkness and emptiness, and they rose up from all corners and filled the room, surrounded him, extinguished the lamp, drowned out his cares, and sealed the world off from him with an impenetrable shroud of ghastly cold mist. This was inexpressibly horrible and tormenting. At such moments he wanted to cry like a little boy and bang his head against the wall. But with every passing day, as Semyonov's life dwindled, these sensations became more and more routine. They erupted with terrible new strength only when some word, gesture, or the sight of a funeral graveyard or coffin reminded him that he was really dying. He avoided these reminders, no longer taking those streets that led past the cemetery, and never going to sleep on his back with his arms crossed on his chest. It was as if two lives had taken shape in him. His former extensive and observable life that couldn't accommodate the idea of death forgot all about it, went about its business, and hoped to live forever, no matter what. And the other life, secret, elusive, hidden like a worm in an apple, which like black darkness filtered through his first life and like venom poisoned it with unbearable, inevitable torment. There was something special about this double life. When Semyonov finally stood face to face with death and understood that his life was finished, he experienced hardly any fear. Already, he asked, only so as to know for sure. After realizing from the faces of those around him that already was the right answer to his question, Semyonov was merely surprised that it was all so simple and natural, like the end of a difficult task that had exhausted him by requiring more strength than he possessed. But he understood right away with a special new inner awareness that it couldn't be otherwise, because death comes only when the organism lacks the strength to go on living. Okay, I'll interject here again with my mother. So Sanin, when he sees his doctor after he's had this hemorrhage, says that single word already. And in my mother's case, when she knew that she'd reached the terminal stage and there were no more treatment options, she had a doctor's appointment. She knew that the doctor was going to tell her that she should go on hospice. And at that point, she just couldn't face it. And so My sister drove her to the clinic, to the cancer clinic, but when they got there, she asked my sister to go in and talk to the doctor, and she would wait in the car. So that was actually how it turned out. That's what they did. And then interestingly, a few days after my mother's death, I had a dream where I met her in a hospital, and she was very pleased that I'd found her there. It was a kind of an afterlife hospital, and she told me that she had one more task to do before she could move on, and that task was go into the doctor's office within the hospital and listen to him tell her that her disease was terminal and there were no more treatment options. And she was happy to do that. She knew it was the last thing she had to do before she could move on to wherever. And so that was a significant dream for me, and I think of that when I read this word already. So yes, I know I'm going to die, but is it really now? Okay. Let's see. I've forgotten if I read this one paragraph or not. I don't think so. He merely felt sorry that he would never get to see anything again. As they took him off to the hospital in a cab, he looked around silently, his tearful eyes wide open, trying to take everything in with one glance, and suffering because he couldn't retain the whole world in his memory to the very last detail, with its sky, people, verdure, and its spacious light blue vistas. He found equally precious and dear all those little things he'd never noticed before, as well as those he'd always considered important and beautiful. The translucent darkening sky with its golden stars, the gaunt black of the cabman in his shabby blue jacket, Novikov with his sad, frightened face, the dusty road, the houses with bright lights in their windows, the dark trees receding quietly behind them, the sound of the wheels, the warm evening breeze, everything that he saw and heard and felt. And this could have come, the inspiration for it could have come directly from Dostoevsky. In particular, I think of The Idiot, but because this was an experience that Dostoevsky actually had of being led to the place of execution, he'd been condemned to death, and he ended up being reprieved at the last minute, but he was fully believing that he was going to be executed. And on the way to his death, as he describes vividly in The Idiot, he is just trying to take in and retain every single little detail. Okay, now let's go on. Afterward, in the hospital, he hurriedly and greedily ran his eyes over the ward, followed and remembered every movement, every face, and every object, until his physical suffering began to displace his surroundings and envelop him in loneliness. All his sensations moved to somewhere deep within his breast, to the source of his suffering. Gradually, he began to withdraw from life. When something appeared before him, it already seemed alien and unnecessary. The final struggle between life and death had begun. It filled his entire being, creating its own special, lonely world of vacillation, glimmers of life, downturns, declines, and desperate efforts. Sometimes he'd experience a moment of clarity. The torments eased, his breathing became deeper and calmer, and images and sounds appeared more or less clearly through the white shroud. But they seemed insignificant and weak, as if they came from far away. Semyonov heard sounds clearly, but it was as if he didn't really hear them properly, and figures around him moved noiselessly, as though in a motion picture projector. At times, familiar faces would appear in his field of vision, but it was as if they were unknown to him and didn't trigger any recollections. Near his neighbor's bed sat a man whose face was strangely clean-shaven, reading a newspaper aloud, but it never occurred to Semyonov to think about why he was reading aloud or to whom. He distinctly heard that the elections in Parliament had been postponed, that an attempt had been made on the life of the Grand Prince, but the words were somehow empty, rising and bursting in a void like bubbles, then disappearing without trace or sound. Lips moved, concealing and revealing teeth. Round eyes rolled. Sheets of paper rustled. The lamp shone on the ceiling evenly, as if large, ominous black flies were circling it incessantly and noiselessly. Then something was born in his brain, glimmered like a bright spot, and began to flare up, illuminating more and more all around. Suddenly, with complete clarity and consciousness, Semyonov understood that everything was unnecessary for him now, that all the hustle and bustle of the world couldn't add even one more hour to his life because he had to die. Once more, he sank into rolling waves of dark mist, and the silent mortal battle began again between two terrible secret forces trying to destroy one another with their imperceptible efforts, but enveloping his whole world in convulsions. The second time he returned to life was when they began weeping and chanting over him. All this was totally unnecessary and had no connection whatsoever with what was happening within him. But once again, for a brief moment, it produced in him a bright spot, fanned it, and he saw and understood completely the sublimely sad face of the man who meant nothing to him, and to whom he meant nothing either. This was his last sign of life. It was followed by something completely incomprehensible and unimaginable for living human beings. So that's as far as the author could go. And what was Artsybashev's own experience of death that he drew this from? That I couldn't say. I mean, he gets so many things right that it amazes me, but you know, I don't have any notion that he went through it himself. His mother did die of tuberculosis. She died, though, when he was 3 years old. So maybe he just spent a lot of time thinking about that, maybe, which is not at all unlikely. He had friends who were dying of tuberculosis or other things. You know, again, it makes me think of my mother and the lack of communications and some of the things that she had wanted to talk about and had talked about in relation to death. She talked about with our parish priest, and not with myself or my sister or my father. And so that was interesting. And we found out, for instance, after she passed away, Father Jerry told us that she had talked about being visited by my paternal grandmother, whom she'd never gotten along with. And she asked Father Jerry why her own mother hadn't come to visit her. And I don't think Father Jerry had an answer for that. I don't know. But I was touched by and interested to learn that she'd talked to him about these things. And thank God she'd been able to do that. And I also think about the one time I did talk to her about her death was because she was an Orthodox Christian and my father and sister are not. My father is a Baptist. My sister doesn't have any affiliations. They had planned a cremation, but in the Orthodox Church, cremation is generally frowned upon. If you can, you know, sometimes you don't have a choice. But I did bring up that subject with my mother because I wanted to find out if it was important to her. And indeed, she did end up being buried rather than cremated. So, yeah, we have Grand Duke Dimitri's experience that has, you know, informed me greatly. He didn't die of tuberculosis. Actually, in the end, he died of kidney failure. And we have another great depiction of someone dying of tuberculosis, again in The Idiot, with the character of Hippolyte, this very excitable young man with revolutionary views. But Sanin, I have to say, this is rare in a novel at this time. I think we have much more of it nowadays. Maybe not, because I don't read that many modern novels. But we have such an intimate view in this book of how death so slowly sort of swallows a person up, and when it's terrifying and when it's okay. And so it's one of the best. Not one of my favorite novels. A good novel, not one of my favorite novels, but this is a death scene that will always stick with me, and as you can see, on a personal level as well. So thank you very much for watching. I would love to get some comments from all of you about your the death scenes that stay with you from literature or even some of your own experiences. So take care. Bye.